Hey folks, welcome to the Adventure Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Mason. Today's a new episode, and oh my gosh, 1,000 episodes. Holy cow, here we are, episode 1,000. It has been a heck of a journey. If you don't know, I wasn't the original host. Kurt and Travis were the ones that first started this show, built it up for the first, 4 years, 4 years, and then handed the show over to me right around episode 420, something like that. And, they built the foundation, they laid that groundwork, they planted all those seeds, and I got to basically reap the harvest all this 5-6 years later. So, man, it has been a heck of a journey. I absolutely love it. So thank you so much to all of you who have been listening for, years, and maybe you're new. You've got a lot of back catalog to listen to. So for those of you that have been around a long time, thank you so much. And for those of you that support us on Patreon, thank you. That means the world to us. I've been getting a lot of letters from folks lately about how much the show means to them. That kind of stuff keeps us going and keeps us wanting to continue to do this and bring the show to you. So first and foremost, thank you to everybody that has helped us get to this point. Without people listening, I really wouldn't have an incentive to keep doing this. I love these conversations. And even if no one ever listened to it, I get a ton of value out of them. But it sure as heck helps. Definitely helps justify it to my family that a lot of other people like it too. So thank you. And this is a huge milestone, of course. And to celebrate this special day, I wanted to have someone on the podcast that has made a really significant impact in my life from an adventure point of view, and that's Alastair Humphreys. If you remember, we had Alastair on back in 2019 to talk about his concept of microadventures. If you've ever heard that phrase, microadventures, or read the book or anything like that is all from Alastair. That's his idea. He coined the phrase, wrote the book, literally, about it. He was selected as a National Geographic Adventurer of the Year because of that concept of microadventures. However, he is someone that has a ton of huge adventure experience. He's most famously known for a 4-year, 46,000-mile bike ride around the world. And now his adventures are all about being as small as possible, being, hours long even, or just overnight. And his most recent project called Local was almost taking that to the extreme. He took a small, 5-mile area around his home and stayed within that area for a year, only doing adventures within that area and breaking it up in a grid pattern and exploring one square at a time, just 5-10 minute drive from his home every week for an entire year. So, and by his admission, he was only able to explore, even over the course of the year, in an area that small, just about a quarter of that whole region. What was crazy is just the huge shift in perspective that he walked away from that experience with, and how much more in love with his home and appreciative of where he is, which he calls boring, and how much more there is to the world than a lot of times we realize. We talk about that a lot on the show. Adventure is not the Himalayas. Adventure is anywhere you want it to be. It's more of a mindset than it is a place. We dive into that concept on this episode. And before I jump in, because I know this is an incredibly long intro, I do want to make an announcement. If you noticed, if you looked at your app and saw our logo, you might notice something different about it, and that is the Outdoors.com logo. We are now part of the Outdoors.com podcasting network. And what Outdoors.com is, it's a voice for all things outdoors. You'll find news, you'll find product reviews, you'll find guides from local experts, hangouts, and tons of amazing stories from adventurers about their adventures, and it's brought to us by Bear Grylls. So if you don't remember, last year I had Bear Grylls on the show twice, and we had, a lot of, it was really great, and I was asked to be part to help launch this Outdoors.com podcasting network, and we are a part of this. If you go to Outdoors.com, you're going to see a lot of stuff in the near future about Adventure Sports Podcast. We're going to share a lot of stories, and they're just going to help us get the word out about this show. So it's very exciting. After this many years, we're finally a part of a network, part of another brand, and it's really cool to be so closely associated with Bear Grylls and the adventure that comes along with that. Yeah, a lot of great things to announce today. We're not stopping anytime soon. This is just another milestone. But thank you so much for the first 1,000 episodes. I'm really looking forward to the next 1,000 episodes because I have every intention to keep bringing the show to you. So, all right, happy adventuring. Share this with somebody, tell somebody about it, and here we go. All right, folks, welcome to the Adventure Sports Podcast, alumni of the show, and one of my earliest, biggest adventure inspirations, Alastair Humphreys, probably best known as a first chair violinist. And so it's so great to have you here on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be back. Good to be chatting to you. And I always like to do podcasts with an athletic brewing Run Wild IPA.
Oh, man, that's awesome. You're a big fan, big fan of athletic. I'll be sure to share this with our UK team. They'll be really excited to hear that.
I'm glad, Mason, you came on drinking a cup of tea in honor of the Englishman, and I got the beer out in honor of your day job working for this brewing company, which by chance was in my fridge.
That is hilarious. Mutual respect here, but well, Alastair, thank you so much. You know, we were talking a little bit before, and you've been on the show before, but this is going to be our 1000th episode, and I couldn't think of a better person to have on than you, because you have been a huge part of my adventure journey. About 10 years ago, my best friend and I were in college. Well, gosh, closer to 15 years now. And we were just talking, you know, what should we do? And we lived in Florida, and that's where I live now. And he said, let's fly to Alaska, get bicycles, and bike all the way back home. We thought we'd come up with some novel idea. We didn't know anybody had ever even thought about doing this. Well, little did we know there's entire companies dedicated to this stuff, making the equipment and routes and everything else. And, you know, one of the first books we picked up was about your 4-year adventure around the world. And that ended up being more or less our training manual and our inspiration for pulling off this summer-long 5,000-mile bike from Alaska to Florida. And ever since, I've been a huge fan of you. So it's great to have you on.
Oh, thank you. I have a map of the world on the ceiling of my shed here, so I'm just cranking my head back to look at it. That's a long old ride you did, isn't it? What a big country you guys live in, and so varied and beautiful and perfect for adventure.
It was really opened my eyes, but I will say, as someone who's done big adventures and is now in a phase of life where that's not as possible, I find myself, just like you, falling in love with my backyard. So tell us a little bit about local, this idea. What was this idea? Because you were well known. I was joking about being a violinist. I know we talked about your busking adventure across Spain last trip, but you are well known for the concept of microadventures, and you walk the walk. What was this idea with this book, Local? What was this all about?
Well, first of all, I need to say well done for reaching 1,000 episodes. That's a serious amount of endurance and persistence, and you've built up a great body of work there. So congratulations. That's very impressive. Here's the next 1,000. So a quick summary is that I started by thinking that adventure meant huge, like you on your cross-country trip. It's like, what can I do that's big and crazy and epic? Because where I live is boring and adventure is far away. That's my thinking. So I got on my bike and I spent 4 years cycling around the world, and I did big stupid stuff like that, which was brilliant for quite a few years. And then I started chasing not chasing. I decided to start doing micro adventures, short, simple, local, affordable adventures, to try and make adventure more accessible for more people in more places more of the time. Like, what can you fit into your weekend or after work? And that's been fantastic to see this micro adventure community grow around the world of people doing that. And then I now decided to try and take it even a step further, which was prompted by me realizing that in many ways I knew more about, well, let's say Alaska than I did about some little town 5 miles down my road, which I've never bothered to go and look at because it's really near and therefore sounds kind of boring. And I live just outside London in the suburbs, and it's pretty boring where I live. And I'd rather live in Florida or Alaska in the way that we often wish we lived somewhere else. And yet I don't. I live here and I don't know the town 5 miles away. So why don't I accept where I live and go have a look at that town 5 miles away? So I came up with a project of just buying the small local map of where I live. It covers about 10 miles by 10 miles, so a really small area. And it's made up of small towns and villages and a bit of farm, but nothing very exciting. And I decided to try and spend 1 year only exploring the small map that I live on. And the map's broken up into 1 kilometer grid squares on the map. And so to give my project some structure, I said every week I'll go to one of these random little grid squares. It's only 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, less than a mile across. Tiny. You could run across that in a few minutes if you were quick. tiny area. Why don't I go there and try and see everything? Every street, every footpath, every bit of woodland, every plant, every animal, really pay attention and see what I find. And I was a bit worried that this idea might be kind of boring because I want to be heading off to far off places, but and that a year was way too long. But I quickly realized that actually there was so much to see if everywhere. Once you start to be interested in everything, then everything becomes interesting. And I started to notice nature and little pockets of wildness, stuff that I'd never seen before. And it completely blew my mind how this tiny little map actually started to feel huge and enormous and full of possibility.
And this is all because the UK is laid out in this really specific, very detailed grid system. So you just bought the local version of that, which was, I think, 20 kilometers by 20 kilometers. So about,
Yes.
15 by 15 miles, which is, essentially a 15, 20-minute drive in either, in one direction across. And you spent an entire year doing that. How many squares did that make up then? 400 or
Well,
so?
well, I went to one grid square per week, so that made 52 squares that I visited. And the country itself isn't I mean, it's just a normal country like anywhere, but the mapping system divides it arbitrarily into 1 kilometer squares, I guess based on latitude and longitude, I suppose. And America has its own version of these sort of maps. Every country is the sort of map you would use to go hiking, I guess, in whatever country you happen to be listening to this in. And it was just a forced constraint, really, because if I'd thought, oh, I'll go explore the map, my tendency would have been to just get on my bike and just cycle everywhere as fast as I could and see everything. And so just forcing myself to be limited to just 1 kilometer a week just made me look at things really differently and just slow down and pay attention.
Before doing this experience, if someone was to ask you, what's the most exciting thing in this grid, 20 by 20 kilometer grid, what would you have said? You have to go see this.
Yeah, so before I started, I would have been, I've lived here quite a lot, 14, 15 years, and I've done a lot of microadventures around here. So I would guess that I know the paths and the trails and the woods and the hills and the streams better than most people do. And I've spent a lot of time biking and hiking and camping all over it. So I think I would have pointed out to people some of the, it's England. It's not wild landscapes, but there's some beautiful little bits of woodland, or there's some really small but kind of beautiful little hills. And maybe I'd have thought that would be the interest. But what I hadn't really considered was stuff like the old industrial warehouses, Victorian era, that had fallen down and crumbled down and now were being rewilded, trees and bushes and wildlife starting to come back, and that sort of sense of wildness appearing in places on the edges of towns. I started to get really interested in the edge between a town and a countryside, that kind of rubbishy, ugly no man's land that you normally just zoom past in your car. I found it really interesting to go look behind the back of the factories and find some foxes or rabbits or trees growing and that sort of thing. So I thought I was going to be interested in sort of finding hiking trails and camping spots, but actually I got much more intrigued by the nature along the way. And actually, I've just remembered now for US listeners that I think the nearest version to the map that I was using, for you guys, you have a 1 to 24,000 topo 7.5 minute maps. Okay, so that's the closest equivalent from my Googling of comparing our maps to yours.
Interesting. Yeah. So the phrase you use, that middle ground, I heard you use the word scuzzy a lot. That kind of disrepair where graffiti is often found.
Yeah.
Maybe some interesting
Broken
characters,
bottles.
broken bottles. All right. So for someone who's seen so much of the world, were you at all intimidated by this challenge, or kind of thinking ahead of time, like, how, this is a cool idea, but how great is the actual experience going to be?
Yeah, I was whatever the opposite of it intimidated is. I was underwhelmed and thinking, yeah, this kind of sounds interesting maybe for half an hour, but is this kind of actually a bit boring and pathetic? So that was my worry when I started. So I bought the map of where I lived and it came through the post. And I opened it up and I thought, right, I'll go explore somewhere. And I decided to choose just somewhere random, somewhere boring, and go have a look at it, but very much give myself permission to quit. Like, if this idea sucks, then I'll quit and just go ride my bike next week like normal. So I wasn't expecting much, but in the same way, I guess that your first podcast isn't particularly interesting, 50 to 100, but once you accumulate 1,000, that becomes a body of work, which actually is far more interesting than the sum of its parts. So too, for me, by going out 52 weeks in a year, rain, sunshine, whatever, I noticed a lot more than just the individual parts. So, for example, I noticed spring come, summer, autumn, winter, seeing the seasons changing, how the weather changed, how nature changes along with that, the daylight hours changing. So I started to become much more tuned into the nature of this place that I live. And yeah, I didn't really like where I lived, and so doing this really helped me appreciate it more and just accept where I live and realize that there's interesting stuff right here on my doorstep, and maybe I don't need to be wishing that I lived in Florida or Alaska, and just accept and embrace right here, like most people have to do. You just have to get on with where you live and with what constraints your life have, and try and squeeze micro adventures around the weekends and squeeze your nature spotting into the scuzzy graffiti bit down the back behind the supermarket, and see what interesting stuff you can find there.
Let's take a quick message break and hear from the folks that help make this show possible.
One thing you might not know about me is I can get down with some cowboy boots. On the weekends, I like to kind of explore my countryside a little bit. I grew up in the country near cattle farms and ranches, so I've spent my fair share of time around cowboy boots and appreciate high-quality boots. And that's why I'm a big fan of Tecovas. Tecovas is my favorite boot brand. They're bringing a fresh perspective to heritage boot making. They carry on time-honored traditions and quality that you find in a great pair of cowboy boots, but they've innovated on comfort, style, and service. Their Western boots for men and women are handmade from the most premium leathers and over 200 time-honored individual steps, and their service is unmatched. If you go into the store, you're greeted like family, offered a boot shine and a drink, and you can get custom fitted for a new pair of boots right there. You can find all their store locations at tecovas.com. And if you can't make it into the store, Tecovas delivers the most premium quality and most comfortable Western goods right to your door. Visit tecovas.com. That's TECOVAS.com, and point your toes west.
That is plenty of that for now. Let's get back into the episode.
Take us through something that you learned about a place you thought you knew but you didn't realize was there. And I'll set up with an example. A few weeks ago, I went camping with some friends on a river here, and we're 100 miles upstream from the ocean. And someone told us you could find crabs, like ocean-dwelling crabs in this river. And there was a crab trap that I saw in the water, and I'm like, there's no way. We're so far from the ocean. It's, there's gators and otters, and there's every kind of freshwater swampy animal here. There's no way there's also ocean-dwelling crabs. And I pick up this trap, and it's filled with massive blue crabs. And I just, of course, the locals knew because they fish for them. I had no idea, and I've grown up here my whole life. And I feel like every time I go out, there's this new thing that I learned that just blows my mind that I had no idea was there. And I think to myself, where have I been my whole life? Where's my head
Yes.
been? Why have I been watching TV or doing any of these things that take away from learning about this place? Did you have an experience like that?
I had a general overall experience of that, very much of just being amazed at how little I'd paid attention to anything all my life. I did a biology degree at university, so I should kind of
I did too.
know a bit about stuff, but I just knew absolutely nothing. And it was only once I started to really question what are these little plants that, hey, that's a pretty little flower that I've literally never noticed before, and then suddenly you'd see it every single week everywhere. I was really interested as well. A great thing about exploring in Britain is just the history you can find everywhere. So I found this little church, and there's in Britain, I learned there are hundreds and hundreds of what are called lost villages, which was quite poignant doing this just after COVID, because back in the day, a few hundred years ago in Britain, there was the plague, the Great Death, that sort of white. It was like a huge virus thing that wiped out almost half the country, and all these villages were empty. And I found this beautiful little church in this tiny little valley that's now is empty and abandoned. And that church has been abandoned for over 500 years. So I actually thought about that Columbus sailing over to America, and ever since that, all the stuff that's happened in the world since then, this tiny little church has just sat in the bottom of this valley empty, and it looks kind of like it did back then. So I loved that oldness and the quietness that you can find in England. England wears its age very lightly, and that was quite a nice part of it, given that a lot of where I live is now busy roads and railway lines and stuff racing around and roaring around. So it's nice to find pockets of wildness and stillness. And actually, what I've really came to discover was that when you've got a huge motorway, a huge freeway going rum, 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 I really came to love the tiny little bits of woodland or land you get just at the strip side of those. They're completely forgotten, ignored spaces, so no one ever goes into them. And I kind of felt quite adventurous and exploring when I was in these little bits of woodland, just as cars just hammering by 20 meters away, didn't even know that I was there, just sitting peacefully in a oak forest. It was lovely.
Wow, that it's interesting, is those little strips of woods might not seem worth exploring or visiting, but it's kind of like going to that church. That church isn't very big, but there's a big difference in the experience of standing 20, 30 yards outside of the church and being inside looking up. That's a totally different experience, and the one being inside is the one you're after. It's worth going and doing. And those little bits of woods are like that. It's worth going in and standing in and experiencing it, just like you would a cathedral or anything else. And I'm sure you're one of the only people doing it.
Yeah, it's great. And yet still there are plastic bottles everywhere. It's just incredible how the litter is everywhere. So that side of things amazed me as well, the sort of destruction of our landscape. But before we get on to the depressing bit, in terms of making that difference, of the difference between just making the effort to actually go there, I chose these grid squares by random. I used like a random number generator on the internet, because if I just looked at a map and chose where to go, then every week I would choose the interesting looking wood or the nice looking hill, the sort of stuff that I always gravitate to. But I didn't want those biases to influence me. So choosing randomly just forced me to go to different places. And often before I get there, I'd look on the map and I'd think, oh man, this looks kind of boring today. Just a few roads and a bit of farmland. This looks pretty boring. But every week I would find something that surprised me and interested me, and made me come back home and start Googling all this random stuff that I discovered and learned about.
So what was the template? What would you try to do? You'd pick a random square kilometer, and what would you go do while you were there? And also, and I've got a follow-up question after that, but what would you do while you were there? What was the goal?
So the goal was to see absolutely everything that was in that square, which I knew was fairly ridiculously ambitious, but I like the sound of that. So I wanted to see every safe footpath or walk around the edge of every field if it was farmland, or if it was in a town, I'd cycle down every single street. And I try to make myself slow down. My tendency in life is to rush. And so I would walk most weeks. Occasionally, if it was a town, I'd cycle just to kind of speed up getting around all the different streets. But generally, I'd cycle to the place, then lock up my bike and walk around to try and see everything. And in order to make myself slow down and resist my tendency to rush, I tried to take really nice photos every week. So even of say a burned out car or some graffiti, or a fallen down tree, whatever it was, I'd try and take nice photos. So that forced me to slow down. And then I wanted to everything I saw, I try and take notes about, so that when I came home, I could Google them and start to learn a bit more about it. It became not really, at the start, I think I thought it was going to be an adventure experience, like let's find a wood and go camping. But it actually turned more into a do-it-yourself university course of just teaching myself all about all these things that I'd never even noticed before in my life. I used an app called Seek by iNaturalist.
Yes, I have that app.
Okay, fantastic. You aim it at a plant or an insect or something, and it tells you the name of it. And suddenly, once you know the name of something, it becomes more interesting, and you start to notice it in more places, and then you start to care about it a bit, and you learn about it, and from that you start to get a richer connection with the landscape. And then the other app that I found it invaluable was called Merlin. And this one listens to bird song and then tells you the name of the bird you're listening to. And so suddenly then that was opening up a new world for me of natural stuff that, I've always kind of liked bird song, but never really paid any attention to it. And suddenly I was noticing it. And then I was learning, wow, this tiny little bird, it's like as small as my little finger, and it flew here from Africa for the summer. Isn't that incredible? So I started to, the more you learn, the more you notice, the more you care, the more you notice, the more you learn, the more you care. This sort of feedback loop of interest grew and grew.
It's like falling in love. You and I'm learning in my own backyard is I'm falling in love with it. And when I'm spending time away from my backyard through work or just family obligations or whatever that takes me away, I feel like I'm missing out. Even if it is traveling to places that are beautiful and, quote, more epic, I want to get back home and I want to learn more. I want to learn in a deeper way. Did you find yourself feeling that way with the other obligations in life throughout this year?
I certainly found myself feeling more connected and interested, but I still always like to go to different places. My favorite thing is just to go somewhere I've never been before. But what I tried to So when I go to some other country, I am so interested in everything. I love the way the supermarkets, the grocery stores are laid out differently. I love the way the traffic lights on the roads beep in a different sound in different countries. Like normal stuff, I just find so interesting in other countries. And at home, there's a tendency just to be like, nah, this is normal. This is how it always is. So what I tried to do exploring this map was to put my adventure head on, my traveler's head on, and to be curious and interested as I would be in some other place. So, for example, you exploring your local map, you're telling me about this, the crab traps and all the crabs. I'm just like, wow, that sounds so amazing. For you, that's just your local little story. It's normal for you, but for you, listening to me talking about a church that's 900 years old, I mean, that's crazy by American terms. So, just trying to have that far off fascination and apply it to your local backyard, I think was a really good mindset to try and generate. And if you do that, you can kind of get the joys and the rewards and the education that we all get from traveling that we love. And you can kind of get that every day if you just choose to pay attention.
When you explore 1 square kilometer at a time, and you're trying to do, see every corner of it and see the whole thing, in each time you went out, you must have attracted attention by locals. What's an interesting interaction you had with locals? What did you learn about local people? And did you alarm anybody?
So one of the things that that struck me the most, which led to one of my growing concerns for the wildlife and nature in Britain, is how few people I saw. Of course, when I was in the towns wandering around, there's lots of people, and in towns, everyone just ignores each other. That's normal. But in the countryside, I saw almost nobody. And this really surprised me. The only people I'd see was occasional dog walkers just near the roads, and I'd sort of say hello to them. So I was surprised how ghostly and empty our countryside felt. And it enforced me one of the reasons why I'd begun this project, which was to try to encourage more people to explore the nature near to where they live. And it seemed surprising to me that there were so few people out there. So no, I didn't really have many astonishing encounters. I was just a bit sad that I was the only guy walking around the woods, really.
That's interesting. I figured, all right, there's this guy on his bike. He's gone down. I've seen him 5 times a day. What is going on is what I would think would be happening. Very suspicious. And all right, so with 1 square kilometer, you also, I would assume, you run into the issue of not having that much variety or that much access to the land to explore. What kind of issues did you run into there? Like if you say it's a 1 square kilometer out in a field, how do you get to it if it's private land? Like how do you explore it?
Yeah, very, very much so. And this is the land access issue became one of my strong things that I was really passionate about. And you'll be interested from an American perspective. It's a very different approach again in America, and you have to bear in mind that in Britain people aren't walking around with guns, so that sort of changes things a bit in terms of access and trespass. But I became really astonished and alarmed at how little land we have access to roam around legally in Britain. And if you compare that to, say, Scandinavia, which has a principle of allemansretten, which means every man's right, every person's right to roam responsibly on the land. So in Scandinavia, people are taught that they have the right to roam around the land. Of course they do, it's their land, but they also have a responsibility to care for it and protect it. And I think that is fantastic. In Britain, we've gone for the opposite approach of let's keep everybody off the land, because if you let them on the land, they'll just cause problems and leave litter behind. So there's very little land that is legally allowed to be roamed on in Britain. However, the reality, of course, is that if you walk around some fields and you don't cause any damage and nobody sees you, then hey, what's the problem? And I've been doing this for years in terms of microadventures, just wild camping in the countryside. Nobody ever sees you. I don't cause any problems. And if anyone did see me, I'd just be polite and it would all kind of probably be fine, unless the farmer got a bit angry. And if he got angry, all he can do is say, get off my land. And that's the end of the story. But I've become quite passionate about this restricted access in Britain. And there's a growing campaign here called the Right to Roam, which is asking for greater access to the countryside, with, of course, the responsibilities to look after it. And personally, I feel one of the problems with us destroying the natural world is because people aren't out in nature very much. They don't notice what's being lost, and they don't really care what's being lost, and therefore it just gets worse and worse and emptier, and it is really sad. So I adopted a policy of just going wherever I wanted to go, and if anyone caught me, I would just apologize in my best polite British accent and see what happened. And I only had one big argument with a farmer over the course of the year.
How did that go?
Well, actually, it was really interesting because he was like, what are you doing? Don't go here, blah, 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 blah. And I started talking to him about what I was doing. And I was saying that how important it is for people to have access to the land because nature's so good for your mental health and all this sort of stuff. And he started telling me that when he'd gone to college in London and he hated the city because all he wanted to be was back out in nature. So he very much understood this desire to be out in nature and how beneficial that is. But he really objected to anyone being on his land, which is there's a sort of interesting contrast in opinions there. But it worked out amicably enough. And it is, though, however, a reminder also that I'm kind of privileged to be able to be doing this stuff because I'm a 6 foot tall, middle class white man. You know, the worst that was going to happen from that farmer guy is he might shout at me a bit, but I'm sort of quite polite and chatty and charming. I go, oh, very sorry, old chap, and we kind of muddle on okay. Things could have been different if I was a woman or black, and the issues then of how open is our countryside to everyone is definitely not an equal playing field yet.
And you're talking about privately owned land, correct?
Yeah, I can hear your American disbelief at this. So yeah,
I mean, that's baffling. I mean, I would never here in America feel comfortable traveling on someone's private land, knowing I could be shot. And I will say I've had a gun pulled on me many times. In fact, just this year, I had to abandon a paddle trip because of weather, and I just parked on a beach on a lake, and the landowner came out and pulled a gun on me. I had to get back out in the weather and make it across the lake, and it's just like, that happens.
So let me tell you a little bit about what would happen, say, in Scandinavia, let's say Norway or Sweden or Finland. So in those sort of countries, there's generally a rule that you don't go within, say, 100 meters of someone's private property, and that's
like their home.
Yeah, your home, your garden. You definitely can't go walking through somebody's garden. You can't put up your tent that sort of overlooks someone's house in a kind of annoying way. You can't go walking through farm yards, like through the buildings of farms. You certainly can't go walking through the middle of a field of corn and trample it down. You can't light a fire in a field of corn. Those sort of things, which I think any sensible person would say, yeah, of course, that's all great stuff. Beyond that, though, you have a right to roam across land that you want to. So, for example, you could definitely come down that lake and get off on the beach, and then you could walk from there back to the road through the farmland and the woods and stuff, absolutely you're allowed to do that, even if it is his privately owned land. So the utopia of that, I guess, is that you have the right to roam in the land, because of course, 250 years ago in America, anyone could walk wherever they wanted. Of course they could, and it was a free land to be cared for, and then gradually that's been hemmed in. So in Scandinavia, you can roam with responsibility, and it's the responsibility part that I think is so important, because by opening up the countryside to a broad range of people, then more people care about it and look after it. So now moving on to Britain, in Scotland, you're pretty much allowed to do that, but in England and Wales, you're not allowed to. You're only allowed to go on the public footpaths, and we're lucky in Britain. We have 140,000 miles of public footpaths, some of them thousands of years old, that you can go walking around. And most of my wanderings around were on these public footpaths most of the time, and for most things that's perfectly enough. But there's sometimes when I want to go have a look in that wood and no one's in that wood, so I'm just going to go and walk around it, and I'm not going to cause any problem at all, but I'm going to go have a walk. And that is when I become a trespasser. And if the farmer caught me there, he could get cross at me and tell me off, and then he can tell me to get off his land, and I would then have to leave his land by the simplest, straightest route, and that's the end of it. It's a civil matter, not, you can't go to prison for that unless you start fighting the farmer. You just have to get off the land.
And no fear of being shot.
Gee, I mean, absolutely no fear of being shot. Yeah,
That's so crazy.
Yeah,
that's wonderful.
I think let's not make our conversation veer towards America or guns, because that's a subject which I'm not qualified to talk about.
Let's take a quick message break and hear from the folks that help make this show possible.
I am a proud user of Manscaped. They are the revolutionary hair trimmer that a lot of men use. And our friends over at Manscaped have been working night and day to bring you below-the-waist grooming experience like none other with their brand new Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra. It's the next generation of trimmer with interchangeable blade heads for whatever shave your mind can imagine. Is it the biggest technological advancement of all time? I think it is. And that's why you need to get it and upgrade your grooming game to the Ultra Sphere this year by going to manscaped.com for 20% off plus free shipping with the code ADVENTURE at checkout. You can take it on the go. This puppy comes with a travel case, travel lock feature to avoid accidentally powering on or off. It's actually really handy. One of my headlamps just died the other night because it turned on by itself in my backpack. And speaking of lights, it has dual LED spotlights just like your regular lawnmower. So like I said, get 20% off plus free shipping with the code ADVENTURE at manscaped.com. It's very high tech for very low places.
That is plenty of that for now. Let's get back into the episode. Wow, that's refreshing. That's exciting. That's wonderful. Now, and I will say, it's there is a decent amount of public land here, even for a state like mine that's so many people. Nearly 30% of this land that I live in Florida is protected and publicly accessible. So, 1/3 already, with a goal of protecting nearly half of it in the next few decades. That is pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's incredible. And the scale of that land compared to little old England is extraordinary for me to consider. When I love America, I love traveling in America, and I just love the emptiness of it. It's just astonishing to me. So yeah, I guess if there'd be lots of different ways to explore your local area depending on different countries' rules and gun wielding farmers, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. So refreshing. I'm looking up this concept now, freedom to roam. I love this. And I'm also looking up that in Finland, you might have said this already, picking berries is part of everyone's right. Being able to pick berries off the land. Foraging. Wow.
Yeah, and fishing, foraging, yeah, all sorts of things. Even Belarus, which is a pretty horrible country that's very good friends with Vladimir Putin. He's basically Putin's only friend. They have this lovely access to Rome and enjoy the rivers and the landscape as well.
No kidding. Hey, it's always a mixed bag.
I think you should do an episode on Allemansretten, the right to roam in different countries. I think it'd be really interesting.
That is a great idea. The right to roam. And so through this experience, what would you say was one of the biggest misconceptions you held prior to doing it, and then completing it? What would you say? What would you say changed the most about something you perceived ahead of time?
Okay, so I can give a positive answer and a negative answer here. The positive side is that I don't really like where I live. It's suburban, it's boring, but
Sounds very positive.
no, this is this is
I'm just kidding.
me being British and positive. So, but actually, when I actually paid attention to it for a year, I realized there were so many places that I'd never seen before. There was woods and footpaths and places to run and ride my bike. And the springtime flowers are beautiful and the fall leaves. So I realized there was way more wildness and nature near to where I live on the edge of a big city than I'd realized. And that was really a really positive thing for going forward. I think the negative side of what I really learned about was that if you look around, a lot of the land on my map is like green English farmland, and I grew up in green English farmland. I like green English farmland. But looking at it, I've always thought, oh, that's nice. It's the countryside. But I actually came to realize just how little nature there is on farmland, and the way that we farm is just an industrial process really that happens outdoors, and it strips the land of nature. It pollutes the rivers, it causes insane emissions. So the connection between the food we eat, the way we use our land, and the loss of nature, that I think shocked me and alarmed me more than anything, and that was a completely new world of discovery for me this year.
So like this blank, beautiful pasture hill on the hillsides is not an ideal landscape, although picturesque, not ideal.
Yeah, it's a green desert, really. And I learned a really interesting phrase. Well, I think it's interesting. It's a bit of a geeky phrase called shifting baseline syndrome. This might be the first discussion of shifting baseline syndrome in your 1,000th
I
episode.
think it
And
is.
you might not have any listeners by episode 1001, but I shall continue. Shifting baseline syndrome is you think about where you grew up as a kid and you think, oh yeah, green fields and nature, that's how the world should be. It was great then and it's got a bit worse now, and that's sad. But then if you asked your father and your grandfather, they would remember very different baselines of what nature was like for them. So each generation, we remember and we romanticize a slightly worse version of the natural world, and we accept that as what we're trying to get back to. So each generation gets worse and worse and worse. And in the case of Britain, I think of these green fields that you see on pretty TV shows about England. That's lovely, but actually it's a green desert. And 100, 200, 300 years ago, there was so much more woodland and nature, and much more variety of species growing. So I realized that what I'd grown up of thinking was lovely natural nature isn't at all. And that really surprised me.
We have talked about that idea, falling in love with what you know as the reality, but that being so much less than your ancestors and those before you. And I heard this quote the other day by the conservationist Aldo Leopold. Can I read it real quick? It talks
Sure.
about this, and I want to know if you went through this. One of the penalties of an ecological education, or just basically learning more about the environment, is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. What it's talking about is a lot of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to just your average person. But as you learn more about the land and as you learn more about history, you realize it's just a world of wounds, from litter to the hillsides being cleared of all trees, to the soil being depleted. The thing you thought was beautiful and wonderful, or maybe just life, ends up being these just very evident scars as you learn more and more about land. It sounds like you found yourself kind of unearthing more and more layers of that as you went on with this project.
Yeah, that's an exact summary of my experience. And I think when I started to do the project, about 10 years ago or so, I wrote this book called Microadventures, which was a kind of cheerful, happy book of, hey, here's how you can go hiking and biking and camping and swimming. And it was like, yeah, this is great. Have some adventures. And I think I assumed I was going to write another book like that. But actually, what I've ended up writing is about the the loss of nature, but also the hope of, hey, it's not easy, but it's relatively simple to fix quite a lot of this. And I think one thing that really struck me is that I've traveled across lots of continents, I've traveled across oceans and deserts, and I've been up in the Arctic near the North Pole, wonderful places, like the sort of stuff you see on David Attenborough shows. But although I loved those trips, I don't think I really bonded with the nature, the natural world in those kind of places. I think, oh yeah, the Arctic, this is a great place for a selfie of me in my tent. What a great trip. But I didn't really get any deeper than that. And when you see, say, on David Attenborough, the poor old polar bear dying on the tiny little ice cap, I look at it and I go, oh, that's really sad. Someone should sort out for those polar bears. Someone should fix this. The government or someone should save these polar bears. And then I don't think any more about it. But going out to see the wood 2 miles away from my house that's being chopped down for a shopping center or something, it has got me so much more connected and involved. And if I'm not going to sort out my backyard, then who is? But I think then, but if each of us start to sort out our backyard, that actually then leads to sorting out the world. So I've got much more interested in the whole bigger environmental picture through getting concerned for my small little neighborhood.
Do you think this is a sense of maturing as an adventurer, to kind of take your view from worldwide to your own backyard and trying to solve that? Do you feel like that's your way of maturing, or that's a natural process as someone who loves adventure?
Yeah, I suspect it's a combination of the actual project of deeply paying attention to what's happening where I live, combined with the fact that I'm just getting old now, and when you get old, you start to care about birds singing and stuff that when I was 25 I'd have thought was really boring. So there's definitely an element of that. But I also think my approach, my attitude to adventure has evolved as well from when I first started, and I wanted to row across oceans and cross deserts. And I was just really after that huge, epic, difficult, crazy, wild stuff. And it was very much a personal challenge for myself that I loved doing, but it was really a sort of kind of pretty selfish thing at heart. Hopefully it might encourage some others, but essentially I was doing it for myself. And I think as I've got older, my approach towards adventure has been that it's great to do that stuff, and I wouldn't deter anyone from cycling from Alaska to Florida for a glorious, life-changing adventure. But as I get older, I'm more interested in adventure plus purpose. How can the things you do also contribute to something a bit bigger than yourself? And I think that adds some depth to your personal experience, as well as creating a more useful output.
Do you think you would feel this way or think this way had you not done your big adventures before?
No, I think that having had the privilege to go and do these great, huge trips, that certainly helped me when I started to encourage people to do microadventures. It helped me to take the feelings and the experiences and the lessons I learned from the big stuff and try and distill that into a smaller, more micro level. So I think that certainly helped with my perspective on adventure. And then in terms of just exploring my local neighborhood, I think one of the reasons I found this mundane experience so interesting was because it was so directly contrasting to the epic, crazy, shiny stuff. And yet it didn't feel worse than that stuff. Very, very different, but not worse. I gave up. One of the reasons I started to do this was I gave up flying for adventure a bunch of years ago, and I really regretted that for a while, because I love flying off to cool places. I love that. But exploring this local map made me feel that I don't feel like I'm missing out now by not getting on a plane. I'm getting very different experiences, but I don't feel I'm missing out. So I think that contrast to the shiny days was quite interesting.
When you left each square kilometer, did you feel like there was more to learn? Of course, there's more to learn from, get a biologist there, or a botanist, or, a geologist or something. There's deeper to understanding. But did you feel, okay, I've gone in what I did, but did you feel like you were leaving almost prematurely? Like, oh man, there's more I could actually see.
No. So very much the former is true. I was often interested to think how what an experience it would be to bring all sorts of different people to this one square and say, hey, tell me what you see and what you are interested in here. But no, from my level, I would generally try and stay in the square until I really felt that I'd exhausted it, or occasionally just till I was really hungry and wanted to go home for lunch. But that shifts a man's priorities. But yeah, generally, I would think I've really done this square justice, and I don't need to return to this square for a while because there are 400 on my map, and I've only been to 52 so far.
Wow. It's really, really fascinating story. And I know you got to go in just a few minutes. You know, I know this is always the pressure of being an adventurer is, you know, being asked what's next. Having your perspective change and having your priorities shift, what would you say is, if you can look down the road in your adventure life, where do you see it going from here?
Well, I think a weird thing when adventure becomes your job as well as your hobby and your identity, there's then a bit of a conflict of things there. But so parking the side of the job for now, like how the heck am I going to earn any money from any of this? The way that I see myself going that interests me the most now are the issues on our land, and they're very combined of the access to our land, which, you know, the lack of access to our land, and the fact that I didn't see anybody out in these woods, and that there's so much nearby nature that no one's paying attention to, and therefore no one cares when it gets chopped down. So trying to get more people accessing to the land, which links on to my second issue of nature loss, which is heartbreaking and tragic. And that leads on to my third issue of the way we use our land. I mean, when you start to learn the statistics of how much space is taken up for different kinds of farming around the country and around the world, it's just absolutely insane. And I see all of these things as being quite linked. So land use leading to so changing land use can lead to cleaning up rivers and reducing emissions and freeing up space for rewilding, planting more trees and things. Also connected to getting more people access to the land. They're the things that really excite me.
Having your perspective shift to those issues more than just the, you know, getting people to have more adventures. Those are really heavy topics that have done a lot of damage to our planet. What about this year, or what about what you've learned about those issues and topics since doing this project have given you the most hope for its future and for the future of our planet, our species, and adventure itself?
So the hope for me comes from, this is so interesting because I now feel nervous about what I'm about to say, which is really interesting because we talked about guns and stuff, but what I'm about to say is that the notion of whether we should eat a cheeseburger for lunch. And it's amazing what a sort of controversial sort of issue this leads to. But what really struck me is the cheeseburger for lunch issue. And, you know, I learned this year that almost half of the of habitable land on the planet is used for agriculture. And at first I was like, wow, that's a lot, but I guess we all need to eat. So, you know, that the way we farm, that's an area of land equivalent to all of the Americas. So North America and South America, plus China, plus Southeast Asia, all of that is covered in farm, which just blew my mind. And that's manifests itself on my local map as well. But I thought, oh, well, we've all got to eat. But then I started to think about, or to learn, you know, that 80% of that land is farmed for beef and dairy production, you know, growing crops to feed to the animals. So theoretically, if we all gave up our cheeseburgers for lunch, that could free up an area of land the size of the USA plus China plus Australia plus Europe combined. So in theory, we can feed the world while also reducing farmland by 75%. And what gives me hope for that is that if I give up my cheeseburger that I love, suddenly there's so much space to plant forests, to clean up rivers, and to completely and utterly bring back nature. So it's not easy, of course, but it's relatively simple. And I like things in life. I like adventures that are simple but not easy. So that's what gives me hope, I think.
It's interesting you take this turn because it's your career. It's difficult, I'm sure, to balance what you're becoming interested in and what your audience is frankly interested in. I'm sure that's a hard line to walk.
Yeah, and I think what's going to really interest me is now that, you know, I started this project thinking, oh, I'm really interested in the adventure in this map. And I came out of it thinking, geez, I want to change the way we use our landscape, and I want to get trees planted and clean up rivers. And I'll be really interested to see whether the audience that I've built up over the years are interested in coming along with me on that journey as well. Or if they're like, no, thanks, dude, we want you for adventure. We'll go follow the other 999 guys on Mason's podcast instead. And I don't know the answer to that, but I guess what I've got to do is just follow what excites me and what feels important to me. That's what I've always tried to do in adventures. And that's, I guess, where I am now. So we'll see. We'll see who comes along for the ride.
You didn't go into this thinking that. You really learned that through the experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that's really interesting, is that if anyone goes out and just really pays attention to their neighborhood, you will find issues there that really spark passion in yourself. And they might be nothing to do with the ones that interest me, but you will definitely, close to where you live, find some issue that you can get passionate about to really bring about some positive change to your community, to your neighborhood, and therefore step by step to the planet. So yeah, adventure plus purpose, that's what we need.
That's awesome. Well, Alastair, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and here's to the next 1,000.
First of all, thank you so much for listening. It means the world to us that you choose to listen to the show. If you'd like to help us further, you can leave a review on iTunes, share us with your friends, your family. It goes a long way to grow in the show. You can also support us financially through patreon.com/adventuresportspodcast. Link is in the show notes. And also, if you have an idea of who could be a good guest for the show, we're always looking for people to tell their story about the outdoors or adventure. So if you know someone, please reach out. Email us at info@adventuresportspodcast.com. And until then, get out there and have some fun.